the people are still coming in, but in the tradition of the Japanese keeping their trains running on time, and respect everybody else's time here, let's get ourselves started. My name is Joseph Gerson, and I'm privileged to be welcoming you to this evening's webinar, Healing the Social Fabric with Nick Rabb. I'm sorry that this evening's webinar necessarily comes as we make our ways through such a profound crisis. Not entirely unlike Germany in the 1930s, a clique of super-rich oligarchs, some with apartheid South African origins, have facilitated the rise of a largely white, Christian, racist, nationalists, and related oligarchs. They are governing lawlessly and unconstitutionally as they assault the institutions of government and its constitutional foundations. Immigrants and students are being seized, placed in inhuman conditions, and in some cases hijacked to dehumanizing prisons in countries like El Salvador. Most critical is the administration's refusal to abide by the Supreme Court's 9-0 unanimous ruling to effect the return of Abergo Garcia, a naturalized U.S. citizen, from his Gestapo-like prison in El Salvador. Universities, freedom of thought and speech are under assault. Know-nothings have launched a trade war against the entire world, save Russia, which we are bound to lose. The trade war is already fueling inflation, jobs are being lost, and the savaging of government agencies means that we are losing not only essential social services, but also hastening the climate emergency. It's in the tradition of Woody Allen's Take the Money and Run. And yes, there are wars in Ukraine, Yemen, the Gaza West Bank genocide, and the nuclear threat against Iran. But as Leonard Cohen reminded us more than a few years ago, there are cracks in everything. That's how the light gets in. Some oligarchs are panicking as they cannot control the fascists they help rise to power. 82% of Americans, including 68% of Republicans, believe that the Trump administration should obey court orders. And by a 37% margin, U.S. adults believe that undocumented immigrants who have been here for 10 years or so should not be deported. They have families and play important roles in our communities. Military veterans and many who are entitled to Social Security benefits, who have been important forces in Trump's base, are losing essential services and access to their benefits. And with job losses and the weakening value of the dollar, millions of us face increasing financial anxiety. This brings to mind Frank Bruni's observation that in this moment, hope isn't an option, it's an obligation. And this evening's webinar with Nick Rabb should provide insights as to how we can transform danger into opportunities. Despite our differences, and in a world of escalating disinformation and misinformation campaigns, we need to learn how to better respond. Power does lie in the people, and as we need to protect our neighbors, defend freedom of thought in our universities, prevent war, and the worst of the climate emergency, we need to even consider possibly building to a general strike to enforce court orders. And to do so, we are going to need to engage our families, our neighbors, fellow and sister workers, and so many others. So let me introduce Nick Rabb. Nick is a relatively new member of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security's board, and he is a postdoctoral researcher at California State University in Los Angeles. I first met and was impressed by Nick before COVID, when he was a lead organizer for the Sunrise Climate Crisis movement here in the Boston area. Nick is a thinker and organizer who is motivated to help people think critically about politics and social life, as well as to develop strategies to move towards a more just, cooperative, and life-affirming, life-giving society. His specialization is misinformation and how to overcome it. Before turning our virtual floor over to Nick, a few words about format and logistics. After his talk, for which he'll be using slides, we'll move to questions and answers. To pose a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom and center of your screen. We ask that you not use that space for comments or debate, as that will limit my ability to see and ask your most thoughtful questions. So with that, Nick, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Joseph. Welcome, everybody. As Joseph mentioned, be using some slides, so take a look at those while I speak. Um, I want to, yeah, just begin by thanking the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, Common Security for having me, giving me the opportunity to speak about some of the work that I've been doing for the past 5 or 6 years, that really stemmed from a lot of the work that I was doing in political organizing when I was in Boston before moving to Los Angeles recently. Misinformation, yeah, is an incredibly complicated topic. Um, and I won't dive into all of the nuances and facets of it, but hopefully what I can share with you tonight is sort of useful for the moment that we're in, that Joseph so eloquently and I think frighteningly, but appropriately described. So I'll dive in first by just sort of starting us off with this sort of foundational question of why do we even consume or care about information in the first place? Um, we don't really think about it very often. I think a lot of us, especially those who are on the webinar tonight, are very good at keeping up with information, and we have our reasons why, but we may not pause to stop and think about why we read the news, think about political things. A common answer is, well, in a democratic society, one that hopes to govern itself and to distribute power justly and equally, we want to be as informed as we can be, so we can be good participants in society and positively shape it towards justice and empathy and inclusion and all the goals that we want. Um, and in this vein, I want to just begin us sort of with a framing taking us back about 100 years to, Joseph was mentioning shocking similarities to German society about 100 years ago, but I want to take us to US society about 100 years ago in the very early 20th century. They were asking questions similar to what I started with. How do we have a democratic society? What does democratic life mean? And their world was changing a lot. I was rereading some work written by, for example, Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone, um, and another book written by Alex Carey writing about democracy, where they both sort of write about the early 20th century as being a period of incredible turmoil in the United States. Technological change was rapid with inventions like electricity, the telegraph, telephone, trains connecting cities physically, as well as the social conditions. There were huge gaps between rich and poor. There is, in Bowling alone, a 1896 estimate that 1% of the population owned more than half of the national wealth, while 44% of families at the bottom owned only 1% of the wealth. So drastic income inequality. And Alex Carey in his work writes about the immigration that was happening at the time from Southern and Eastern Europe, which sparked very racist anti-immigrant campaigns, trying to Americanize immigrants, um, what he calls the first Red Scare, the anti-Bolshevik movement and campaign after the First World War, desire to break labor unions in the US. So society was a chaotic place in a lot of similar ways to today, and we know that this sort of led into major world conflicts because of the way that democracies were sort of being overrun by authoritarian control. Well, two thinkers in this time were talking specifically about information and democracy. So these are two uh, sort of monumental thinkers of the time, Walter Lippmann, who was a public intellectual media commentator of the time, and John Dewey, who's an American pragmatist philosopher and educational theorist. They were really leading scholars and critics in their era, and they were discussing um, how to basically have a democratic society given all of the changes that were happening in their world. Lippmann, in I want to say 1922, released a book called Public Opinion, in which he critiqued the new sort of globalized society and this conception that we need to inform ourselves to have a democracy, saying that it's actually impossible to inform ourselves properly to be responsible stewards of a democracy. He critiqued the Jeffersonian ideal, and he said, we're too plagued by stereotype thinking, biased thinking, and small pieces of information that don't capture the whole picture. So his solution, as he said, democracy in this sense is not possible, was to establish institutions run by experts that would guide society in a responsible direction. Dewey responded to this vision about 5 years later in a book called The Public and Its Problems. He accepted Lippmann's critique. He said, you know, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is too much for any one person to know. But Dewey argued that instead of thinking of a democratic society as something where you imagine the structure immediately and then impose it from the top down, a democracy can emerge if we're all adopting a sort of democratic ethic, genuinely cooperating with one another, having rich associative community life, and making sure all the structures that we're a part of at our own local level are equitable, distributing power and resources, and that will build a democratic society from the bottom up. So Lippmann's version was a top-down sort of version of informing ourselves from experts, having a democracy. Dewey's was, well, acting with a democratic ethic and having a democracy that way. Now, I think, as I've read both these scholars, is that there are benefits to both, right? We need experts, and I think I value my own sort of experience diving deeply into an area of research and trying to share those results with people to inform us on how to guide society. But we also need bottom-up associative life where we're cooperating and building rich communities and working within our local systems to make them equitable and distribute resources. And in this sense, I think that taking both of these aspects into consideration, we can finally sort of say to begin our discussion about misinformation that there are good types of information for having democratic life and types of information that are bad for democratic life. Information that's good for democracy is as true as it could possibly be. It encourages sociality, building empathy with others. And I do use empathy in sort of a somewhat technical way. I take this from, what's his name? The book's right there. Jason Stanley's work when he writes about propaganda. He cites political theory about democracy and says that empathy is actually something that is necessary for a democratic society to treat all participants as worthy of being part of society and taking their considerations seriously in the public sphere. So I use empathy in that sort of technical sense as necessary for democracy. And good information should also enable us to take democratic action, like vote, have deliberation, change people's minds to a more justice-oriented mindset, and then build equitable structures and policies. In contrast, bad information that's bad for democracy is not true or misleading. It erodes empathy for others. It encourages or policies and leads more towards autocratic ways of life. Because if you think about it, if we all didn't really care and we just lived in an autocracy where people ran our lives anyway, we wouldn't need to know anything in the first place, right? We would just kind of live our lives. So in order to have a democracy, we need this type of good information. And to sort of tie or tease the end of the story with Lippmann and Dewey, as time went on, Lippmann's vision ended up being the one out. So society ended up going sort of in a direction of part of this type of good information being valued, the truthful part, where we saw the establishment of professionalized journalism, professionalized science as sort of the truth-keeping institutions in our society. And that reigned for quite a while. Dewey had his sort of moment with the progressive era in the United States as there were rich community associations for a while, but those declined notably after the post-war period and especially in the neoliberal era. And they're very, very, I think, declined now. This is more or less the thesis of Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, so you can read that if you want to know more. But what we sort of ended is this expert society that now in recent decades has been pushed back against and has lost a lot of legitimacy. And this is setting the stage for what has become this phenomenon that we're trying to describe, misinformation. So let's talk finally, now I'll finally, what is misinformation? Well, I'll describe it from an academic sort of standpoint because that's how I learned about it while I was doing my PhD thesis for the past 5 years. So misinformation as a field of study, which then sort of became a term picked up by media, began in response to what were seen as shocking political events in 2016, most notably Trump's election in the United States and Brexit. There was this sort of grappling in our societies, if you remember back to then, of whoa, what is going on? How can these things be happening? They were seemingly impossible actions that now seem very possible and very real. Um, but scientists across disciplines, including, psychology, political science, media studies, wanted to sort of band together to study, wait, why are so many people agreeing to sort of reject the order of society that had existed up until then? It also had, a lot, there's been a lot of study of false information before this, like notably in climate denial, science denial, and then misinformation continued to study in a big way COVID denial, mask wearing behavior, which is what I wrote my thesis on, and vaccine, I think they called it hesitancy, vaccine hesitancy, and election denial and conspiracy theories like Bill Gates putting microchips in vaccines and such. Um, so as it sort of began in 2016, I want to make very, very clear that it's not a new sort of thing. It was just a new word, but it's a field of study that has deep roots, as I mentioned, thinkers 100 years back who are thinking about very similar things. It has deep roots in over a century of media and what were called at the time propaganda studies that I draw a lot of my thinking from. And misinformation also has a lot of branches. There's a lot of sub-disciplines that fall under the sort of umbrella, including polarization studies, hate speech, social media studies, what's called motivated reasoning, political reasoning. And I'm not going to really dive into these, but just know that these all sort of inform what we're going to talk about. And there's a way to sort of talk about the big picture while taking these smaller bits into consideration. But basically, at its core, I think misinformation and why people wanted to study it was driven by some fundamental questions, two of which tended to be, okay, why are people rejecting the experts and established institutions of knowledge? Think about science denial, not believing in journalism, and why are people adopting such hateful beliefs? Basically, why is politics sliding to the right and people are going along with it? So to start to answer some of these questions, we can dive into some of the research behind why people believe misinformation. Um, I'll start by saying it's very complicated. There are a lot of facets of belief, political belief, that all happen at the same time. Capturing this kind of complexity is something that the field has really been trying to move towards. Um, but once you lay it out, it is reasonable and it does make sense. So this diagram sort of is my way of showing you that when any of us adopt a sort of political belief, like, oh my gosh, the COVID virus is very dangerous, information is coming to us from various media sources, um, some of which we have different levels of trust in. And the sources could be an institution, a specific journalist, maybe an influencer, something like this. The information then interacts with our own personal identity and our social position, as well as our existing worldview, morality, ideology, previously held beliefs. And it's all sort of happening through the mediating influence of technology. So it's happening through, smartphones, computers, um, TV, podcast, radio, other devices. And it's all sort of happening in concert with other equally complicated people who are subscribing to various media sources, have different worldviews. So it makes this almost like network view of us all sort of being a living, breathing body of adopting belief and sharing information around society. But this picture of what leads to our belief is useful because it helps us learn about why certain narratives are very effective misinformation narratives. Some of the strongest ones play on these factors of our belief process of worldview, tapping into ideology, identity, and trust relations. So an example of this is when people are presented with, saying we can't make political intervention to address the climate crisis. This message is coming with other bits of information. They wrap it in this sort of distrust of the government. They can't really enforce this policy. They're using climate to justify taking away your American way of life, taking away hamburgers and air travel. And, it's being put forward by unrealistic liberals. So they draw like in and out group relations. That packaging makes the information more digestible and more seem more true for certain people who have those ideologies and worldviews. Same thing with COVID. A lot of the anti-vaccination stuff is premised on distrust in government and science or big pharma, and saying that it's forcing you to get a vaccine is infringing on individual liberties. Other aspects of misinformation narratives that make them more believable and also hard to correct are that often the best misinformation narratives appeal to real issues. And I will say the right is very good at this. They will say, hey, we know your material circumstances are quite bad and your lives are very hard. And the people who said they're going to help you, for example, Democrats, liberals, leftists, whoever, are not helping you, but I'm going to take you seriously. This opens the door for people to start to believe things. And then they also put forward narratives that are empathy reducing, drawing in and out group relations. So basically saying, we're great, the other people are evil and they're totally wrong. That sort of shuts off logical processing in your brain. And they also tap into existing ideologies, typically flawed ideologies, like ideas of racial hierarchy, patriarchy, meritocracy. You can go on and on. But by sort of um, layering new information on top of existing worldviews, it makes it seem more true because it resonates with people more. And in the end, because a lot of this information is geared at your identity and your worldview and your ideology, when you start to believe certain things, it actually makes people reject information that threatens their identity and worldview. So if you believe, I'm an American, I believe in individual rights, and you hear something that's like being told to wear a mask is an infringement on your American way of life, you're like, yes, I believe this. If someone comes over and says, well, wearing a mask is a good way to keep other people safe, this, because it's been so tied to your identity, makes you feel threatened. And then you're like, oh, I don't believe this. This makes me angry. This is total garbage. Um, and also, as much as narrative elements contribute to belief in information, so do major structural changes in the new media ecosystem, which I'll just briefly describe. Media ecosystem is a word that we use to sort of describe the relationship between information producers and consumers. And the line is blurry because these days some of us are also simultaneously producers of information and consumers. But you can think of, journalistic institutions, high profile people as being media producers. The government is a media producer. They have a whole PR arm, and then we're sort of ingesting the information. That's sort of the ecosystem, is the confluence of groups and institutions and individuals. Um, so technological change in the form of smartphones, computers, the internet, social media has changed the media ecosystem drastically. It's created far more information producers than existed before, and far more consumers. We're consuming information a lot more. It also has split the ecosystem into more communities and sort of subgroups of affiliation where people can form little groups around common characteristics. And this has changed trust relations in sort of the old established institutions that were keepers of truth. So yeah, just think about basically, not so long ago, there were only a few sort of major journals and TV channels that were viewed as the most credible information producers. Now there's just, thousands. And if people are dissatisfied with some of them, they'll gravitate towards others, right? So it's shifting the whole structure of our media environment. And some of the effects of this are that, a lot of information is not passing through editorial filter anymore, which has benefits and negatives, because the old information ecosystem was sort of hiding a lot of information and telling lies in certain ways. And that sort of led to the loss of legitimacy in those institutions for some of us. But now it's more so that anyone can publish a lot of things, and people can have very popular podcasts and not really have any sort of expertise or training or deep worldviews. Um, we're all getting information from different sources, even if some of the ideas do converge. And as a result, our perceptions of reality, because a lot of our reality is sort of virtually constructed. For example, not many of us, well, maybe some of us on this call, because it's this type of webinar, but I would um, believe that probably most of us have not been physically seeing, for example, events in Palestine, but we hear about them through the news. So that's all to say that a lot of our worldview is virtually constructed. So if we're believing different sources and seeing different sort of information that constructs our virtual worldview, then our literal perception of reality is growing apart. Um, some other things about the technology that are worth noting is just that the sort of cycle of how often we're exposed to information is very fast. The news cycle also moves fast, and we're sort of whipped around, and we can't gain deep knowledge about things unless we take the time to study stuff. Political dialogue doesn't work super well through social media because it offers limited information capacity, just short text or videos, and prioritizes more sensational type of interaction rather than empathetic interaction. And also the way information is ordered by algorithms doesn't foster understanding of other views. It just exposes us to what keeps us on the platforms the longest, which is often outrageous information. So the combination of these two things, the narratives and the structural changes, are an incredibly dangerous combination. Because in the end, we consume manipulative information in a sort of shallow way, where then we're not given the time or resources to figure out what's going on or deliberate. And also the nature of the narratives and the structures push us more into group and identity-based thinking, which makes reconciling different views very difficult. Uh, and the result has been that false information is widely believed, and the social structure is pretty fractured as trust is manipulated and alternative media sources are the new sort of experts these days. And now is the time that I get to say, you could have been imagining this in your head sort of the whole time as, yes, this is a problem that's pulling people to the right and it's pulling people into hateful politics. That's absolutely true. But unfortunately, we're all sort of subject to this misinformation dynamic, even if it's not purely false information. I'll admit my own bias. Uh, I would put myself on the sort of like left side of the spectrum. As I talk about left, center, and right types of narratives, these are caricatures, but sometimes I even find it difficult to find flaws in my own sort of subset of the media ecosystem. But they absolutely exist. Um, and I'll just give some examples. So some examples of misinformation that maybe you would see if you're someone who is in a left-leaning media ecosystem is this idea of like, oh, I'm an abolitionist. All cops are fascists. And if you don't agree, you're part of the problem. This is an overgeneralization. It's not true. You can talk about a system without talking about individuals. Anyway, there's much more nuance to it, but it plays on these elements of identity, of you being an abolitionist, manipulating your trust and empathy in other people, saying those who don't agree with you, you write them off, they're problematic, and it pulls on your sort of ideological elements. Um, this happens sort of in liberal media, which when I study things tends to be like CNN, MSNBC, um, else would you put there? Washington Post, these like sort of establishment type of institutions. They may, hear certain things that are like, oh, well, I'm highly educated. The economy is doing fine, even if people don't believe that it's doing fine. It's just that they're uneducated. They don't know. That's also playing into identity and sort of reducing empathy for normal people or uneducated people. And it's, a bit elitist, it's classist. And then we're very familiar with things on the right. So I feel like I don't necessarily need to rehash those. But suffice to say, this happens to all of us. And even if, for example, you're a very thoughtful scholar who leans to the left, you might be getting very true information and very nuanced information, but maybe you're missing pieces that are not helping you build empathy for other people, and they're actually making you dismiss people who don't hold the same view as you. Um, and so that's all sort of, very evidence-based type of stuff that I was citing. Now I'm going to editorialize a little bit and say that I also think the combination of these two elements creates a dynamic that plays out when major political events occur. This is something um, I hope to study formally one day because I think it's very important, but seems to happen in my life and in the sort of things that I see happening all the time is that when major political events happen, we hear about them and make some sort of meaning on them based on our own experts within our own sort of sub ecosystem. And then we engage in dialogue or hear more interpretations in the media or social media that are all sort of geared towards more division. So we're um, sort of in this environment where legitimate political disagreement or curiosity is felt as a threat to us. And then we fight with each other. And the result of this is that people who maybe had legitimate political questions are either pushed away to some alternative sort of media source or community and not really brought to justice-oriented ideas that I happen to think are correct. I'll give, I had two examples. I think I'll just give one of the examples because I think it suffices to just give one for the sake of time. One that's interesting is talking about vaccination to illustrate this dynamic. So when the vaccine was strongly encouraged by the Biden administration, that some workers and federal workers and students were required to get it, there were different interpretations of this based on the sort of media ecosystem, sub-ecosystem you were a part of. If you were, subscribing to more left-leaning stuff or liberal centrist type of stuff, you would hear that, everyone should be vaccinated and we need to protect the most vulnerable people. If you're in a right-leaning media sub-ecosystem, you're hearing things like, well, the vaccine mandates are the government impinging on individual rights. The vaccine may cause issues. And then as time passed, we saw that conservatives got vaccinated in far fewer numbers than other political centers, and it developed sort of a secondary type of dialogue about this issue where, people on the left, which, I would hear this anecdotally, I don't know how widespread it was, but they would be like, oh, the Republicans, they believe in mass death. They want us all to die. People maybe in a liberal centrist ecosystem would say like, oh, don't people who don't believe in vaccines, don't they believe in science? Like Republicans are such idiots. And this was literally on the news. I would like hear this when I was doing my research. And then the right, they're like, oh, the liberals are idiots. Everyone's yelling at me. Screw you, basically. So this dynamic, I think, is quite unfortunate because there are legitimate questions of truth and governance in this event that could have been hashed out. Some of these questions, like was the vaccine tested enough? Were the side effects studied? And can you point to the data to really like argue this point? Were somewhat overlooked. I mean, I think I'll just say for myself, I, have a PhD, I'm a scientist, but that's not my specialty. When I chose to get vaccinated, it was more out of trust. I trusted that they were doing the right thing. Um, but I could not say, rigorously why or why not it would be a good thing and if it would have had side effects. And then as sort of things progressed, I think there were certain side effects that were statistically quite small in comparison to the whole population, and getting vaccinated is still a good idea. But then the discussion of even those small side effects, even if they're statistically maybe insignificant, is not really picked up. It's sort of treated as, oh, you're an anti-vaxxer, which is unfortunate, I think. Um, Other legitimate questions, there could have been a discussion of how to reconcile big pharma's capitalist incentives with the public needs. If that's a legitimate worry of some people, we should be talking about it, right? And then there's also a deep question of when should individual liberties be ignored for the good of the collective? If it seems like a very easy choice in this case, well, think of the sort of weird flip side of this now, where um, now free speech, speech about Palestine is saying, well, individual rights can be squashed if you're viewed as a security threat. And it's not to say that that's a legitimate argument. I think that's an illegitimate argument, but it's just that we don't even get to that level because the debate or the deliberation doesn't get to anything substantive. Truly, it sort of sits at the surface because we're all just sort of mad at each other for being evil in different ways. Um, so yes, instead of substantive debate, um, it devolves into an identity battle, basically driven by this horrible media ecosystem that we're a part of. Like, I'm good, you're bad, I'm right, you're wrong. And then we push people away from pro-social beliefs or justice-oriented beliefs and isolate them when they could have had genuine curiosity. And when we isolate people away, they're more likely to fall into some other media ecosystem or some other community that doesn't shame them or shun them. And the right, I will say, is very good, I think, at picking up people who feel dejected by the sort of status quo, or sometimes honestly feel shamed by people who are like left leaning when they have like legitimate misunderstandings about the world. And instead of being brought in and seeing it as an opportunity for education, they're sort of isolated and shunned. So then they find a community and fall into even further sort of far right views. I think I've seen this anecdotally a lot. I'm not entirely sure what the research says on this or if it's studied at all, especially because misinformation is one of those you can't get funded for researching it anymore types of things. So we'll see. The second example I was going to give was about Palestine, but I'll skip over it because I think you got the gist from the vaccination example. So really, if we sort of remember back to how I was saying there's information that's good for democracy and there's information that is harmful for democracy. What seems to be happening is that no real side, and I say side in a very loose way, just because I caricaturized these, left, liberal, center, and right sort of media spheres, none of them are really reaching the most democracy enabling interpretation of events. Even if, for example, in the vaccination case, you know, the left and the sort of liberal media were arriving at the most scientifically rigorous and valid version of events, they're not receiving information that builds empathy for those with different views, pushes them to understand others' views, or even gives them any information on how to move people with the incorrect view over to a more correct view. We're just sort of left in this space where we don't know what to do when people succumb to false information. And um, unfortunately, I don't think the sort of right-leaning media ecosystem is just going to disappear anytime soon. That would obviously be the easiest solution to the problem, but it seems that I don't know quite how to do that. If you all know how to do that, please bring that into the Q&A because that would make my life so much easier. Um, so what I want to sort of now talk about is in lieu of us not being able to do that, what would it mean to try to intervene into this misinformation dynamic and build skills and a movement that can, how I've been calling, sort of repair this social fabric? So I think to do this, we have to change our relationship to information. Right now, our sort of mode of information interaction is that we consume information to try to know what's happening and what might happen. We consume it a lot, some of us are quite addicted to consuming news. We think we're consuming the truth, the whole truth, but it's maybe just, factually true, but we don't really consume how to understand other people's points of views. And then we deliberate more so by debating and wanting to be right and make others sort of just snap over to our viewpoint. And like I said, we consume a lot of information, but have no idea how to fix anything. Or maybe I think the people in this webinar I will give much more credit to. I think you all have great ideas about how to fix things. But when I talk to a lot of people who are less sort of politically involved or not activists or not organizers, a lot of people have absolutely no idea what to do about any of this. They're just taking in all this scary stuff, and it's truly like paralyzing for a lot of people. Um, so three things that I want to uplift that I think can move us forward is adopting a democratic ethic a la Dewey. So I'll bring Dewey back. Consciously and reflectively consuming information and how to engage in more productive political dialogue. So first, the democratic ethic. I just want to say that I think Dewey absolutely nailed it. I think Dewey got it right 100 years ago. Um, by deeply committing to community life and trying to make the structures that we exist in as just and equitable and democratic as possible and extending empathy to others and building a rich, diverse community, I think it does a lot of work to solve this type of misinformation dynamic that we see right now. Um, and the reason that it does this is exactly the reason why I think a lot of us avoid doing this is because it's really, really hard. It's really difficult because when we work in our own spaces to make them democratic, you have to work with people who have different views than you. I think it's a little easier in virtual space to connect with people who already agree with you. Or if you work on national issues, you basically have, rallies with people who more or less agree with you, and you try to use that to exert influence over the people who don't agree with you. But if you're doing something like, for example, forming a labor union in your institution, which I did at my grad school a couple of years ago, you have to talk with people who don't share your point of view. And you have to find a way to engage in solidarity with them and find points of commonality while also not losing your own view. I don't want to say reconciling disparate worldviews is like, the Democrats' version of it, where they're like, oh, we just basically slide slowly to the right in the spirit of bipartisan agreement. I think that's totally incorrect. We have to learn to hold on to our justice-oriented beliefs, but also meet people where they're at and hear what they're saying and try to, maybe bring them over. And that's a different way of reconciling different worldviews. So I think the democratic ethic can bring us very far. We can also engage with our information a bit more reflectively and consciously by trying to find our own biases and the biases of the media that we consume, sort of doing that exercise that I had to do when making these slides by being like, okay, what are narratives in the left that are also sort of empathy reducing or overgeneralizing or a bit fallacious? Um, being honest about what we don't know and how complicated things are and trying to change our information dynamics so it's not so just consuming stressful things and not knowing what to do with it. But the thing I really want to emphasize is this idea of productive political dialogue. I think instead of being debaters, when we talk with other people who don't agree with us, we should try to become better educators and view dialogue as an opportunity for other people to learn as well as ourselves to learn. I study education now in my postdoc role at Cal State LA. So I've learned a lot about what makes people more able to ingest information when it's very difficult to change your mind. Um, that's most likely to happen when people are believed in, seen as people who can grow and are capable of change, when the learning environment is safe and non-judgmental, when teaching and learning is done in deep relationship with other people over time, and when learners are met where they're at. So you're not expecting more out of them. You're willing to hear their point of view and say, okay, I see that for who you are and I don't judge it. Let's work with that. Um, uh, yeah, this is very difficult because belief is very complicated, but um, I think these things are incredibly difficult. So I think if we want to start repairing the social fabric, we actually have to practice these things because our culture does not make it easy for us to do these. Um, we should strive to get to a place where, like I said, we can hold our beliefs and accept other viewpoints, but skillfully help, basically everybody grow to a more justice-oriented view without sort of succumbing to, right-leaning views and stuff like this. And I also just wanted to uplift, you know, I have done a lot of organizing and advocacy, so I don't want to just give you individual solutions, maybe also some visioning of what structural solutions could look like. I think it's notable that in our society, we don't actually have any community structures that we use to help us process and deliberate information. This makes me think of Putnam's work in Bowling Alone when, in the old United States, there were lots of groups of association in regular communities where people would talk about politics. Or, in the stereotypical idea of democracy in, Tocqueville's sort of view, is this idea of like having, deliberations in coffee shops or in a salon, and like this being a foundational element of a democratic society. I don't think we really have that. We just kind of go on the internet and talk with each other, which is I think, wholly unproductive way of having a democratic society. Um, and then, of course, I think I want to, put out that we could imagine campaigns to push back against media and try to, deconstruct far-right media, change institutions from the inside and the outside. There could be campaigns for democratic education in schools or media literacy, campaigns to boycott harmful media, unplug people from it and plug them into something better. And people who work inside journalism or science, like including myself, could push to make our own structures embody this democratic ethic as sort of training grounds to learn how to break this misinformation dynamic. So I'll just end by saying, re-invoking Lippmann and Dewey and saying that I think this is a pivotal moment for us. Like Joseph was saying in the introduction, it mirrors a time 100 years ago where we ended up in two world wars. We saw the rise of, as we came to know it, modern fascism, and there are shockingly similar elements today. I think we can learn from what very intelligent people back then were saying, apply it to our situation today, and hopefully use this as an opportunity to really change how we operate and transform the society in a positive way that embodies true democracy so we avoid all that awful, horrible history and violence that we had 100 years ago and go in a positive direction today. I think we can do it. It's just not going to be easy, but it's certainly possible. Um, so that's all I had for you today. Um, I thank you very much for hearing what I had to say. Again, thank you very much to the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security for having me. I'm very grateful to be able to share these ideas with you. Look forward to your questions. And if you want to hear more from me, I am kind of sort of on the internet in some ways. I do some writing and some very mild social media usage where I try to sound smart for everybody. So thank you very much.
Nick, thank you. There was a lot there. And I'm going to be interested to hear look at people's questions and your responses. I need to do one thing before we begin that, which is to talk about a communication problem that we've had here with the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. Um, I won't go into detail about it, but just to say that a webinar surprise means that we have to cough up some money that we barely have. So Mariana Fernandez, who's been kind enough to anchor us via Zoom, will post the donate link for the campaign. If you'd like to help us out as we try to raise here several $1,000s to deal with it, we will be most grateful. So then I wanted to start with two questions, and then I'll turn with what's there in the Q&A, and just to encourage people to use the Q&A box to uh, pose your questions. Um, the first, I guess, has to do with the structures of culture.
Mm,
I was in a webinar earlier today with Richard Sakwa, who'll be doing a webinar for us in May. I mean, a really world-class international relations scholar. And he was pointing to the, if you will, the persistence of culture, um, uh, making some things more difficult to overcome.
mm,
How would you talk about um, uh, if you will, uh, inadequate thinking, inadequate ideas, inadequate communication, which are basically part of the cultural inheritance. I mean, we can look, for example, to the history of slavery here in this country, or say the tradition of Crusader Christianity. How do
mm.
we deal with these forces in terms of communication?
It's a very good question. Um, yeah, I mean, the first thing it makes me think of is I think it's exactly right that these sort of deep-seated, long-held aspects of our culture and upbringing and ethos are some of those aspects that have been highlighted in misinformation research as really making certain narratives seem more believable. Like when certain narratives tap into racism, for example, when in the media, the US is talking about, or, government is talking about certain things going on in China, critiquing China, starting conflict with China. It's sort of to say that we have this sort of way of operation where instead of being able to critique parts of, say, a nation or a government that are worthy of critique and leaving all the other parts aside, um, the effective narratives and the sort of fear mongering against China taps into this deep-seated racism that has been, in the United States for hundreds of years. And that's just one small example. You could take any sort of oppressive ideology, sexism, heteronormativity, patriarchy, and say that for those who sort of um, feel resonance with these features of a culture, narratives that tailor themselves to those features will be believed more easily. So it's unfortunate because, as I think you're getting at, Joseph, the United States has quite a, I would say, disturbing and regressive history, having, yeah, been founded on genocide, having built its world power and wealth on the most violent, brutal form of slavery in the world, treating women as inferior for hundreds of years. These things are still with us. So if we could have had a society with a different culture, some of these things maybe wouldn't have been as easy to tap into with misinformation. And one would hope that some of these things with time would have been combated, for example, by social movement from the left.
Mhm.
How I think it's very true that a lot of people have much different culture these days than these sort of oppressive ideologies. But for some reason, a lot of them still stick. And a lot of the misinformation that we see, yeah, is just continuations of these wars. When people when we're fighting for, like in science, to keep funding for DEI, it's just a prolonged conversation about racism. And the funding just taps into people's existing sort of racist culture. And combating those is the most difficult thing that we can do. But unless we tackle it, it'll keep happening, right?
So just to, as I go into the other question, just to say this, as I began with the introduction, and thank you for your answer there. I also see as much as we're dealing with some very frightening and dangerous realities here in this country, I think there also are some unique opportunities for us in the middle of it all. Because as I said, I mean, a number of people in what have been the right wing base are going to be hurt by what Trump and his associates are doing. And in that is we can find ways to engage those who are being hurt and be able to provide both sympathy, say sympathy and resources, uh, but also, compassionate analysis. We may be able to bring more with us. So I would say that. Just one other question, then I'll turn to what's in the Q&A box. And I could see about 4 or 5 right there now, 7 now. Good. Um, just to say that, there are elements here where uh, reality hits the information mode, and it makes things confusing. So let's just say that I can certainly remember in the early period of COVID, there was discussion, mostly from the right, about herd immunity.
Mhm.
And now we're in a situation where we have the head of Health and Human Services is going after vaccines, cutting back health, and as an old person with my own health issues, I have to be concerned that maybe they're thinking in a social Darwinist way. Excuse me, I'm not getting that out. Um, a way to cull the herd. So how would you advise that we talk in terms of the threat to health in this context?
Yeah, that's another very good question. Yeah, it's tough because, I think this um, sort of, again, like just to get back to your last question, when you mentioned this idea of social Darwinism, I think I'll say it like that. I'm not sure if that's the right way to put it. We both struggled with it. Um, uh, if this is sort of the ideology that is being seeded through this type of anti-vaccine discourse, which it may very well be. I'm not really in tune with what people are saying, but I could easily see this sort of turning into like some sort of, well, you know, uh, if the fit survive, then so be it. Yeah, if you need the vaccine, you're weak. It ties into patriarchy. But social Darwinism in the era I was mentioning 100 years ago was the dominant mode of thought.
Mhm, mhm,
And it's just fascinating to see, as you were saying before, this long-standing culture sort of re-emerging and tying its thread through, a new era. Um, there are people who write about social Darwinism being very related to this idea of like the neoliberal idea of the free market, entrepreneurial, every person for themselves, pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of ideology. It makes sense that it could be applied to then this health
mhm.
context. You got to pull up your own health by its own bootstraps. So it's interconnected with all these other things. And I think it's unfortunate how you sort of were saying there may be opportunities when people experience harm for mindsets to change. You certainly don't want that to have to be the case, of course. We don't want harm to happen. But I think you're absolutely correct that even in this health circumstance, if there are large outbreaks of health problems, people will be looking for some sort of explanation. Why is this happening? Why are people getting sick? I would hope that we'd be able to sort of respond to that, like you were saying, and bring people into sort of a better worldview and be empathetic with them and try to help them out, which then does a lot to being able to influence, their mindsets in other ways because you're building trust with people and community. Um, and at the same time, I have a bit of skepticism coming up because it's sort of what happened with COVID. And then a lot of people, despite millions of deaths,
Mhm.
still didn't believe that the virus was any more dangerous than the flu. So the media has an incredible effect on reality perceptions, even when real events are giving you very strong signals of danger. So it's something we have to tackle.
Great, thank you. I'm remembering chlorine here at the moment. So going through the questions that we've got here, Gene Reynolds asked, why do you use the term misinformation instead of disinformation? How do you differentiate between those two terms?
Very good question. Thank you for the question. This is one of the most like it's one of these academic debates that's like ongoing. People use the terms sometimes interchangeably. No one even really has a sharp definition for misinformation versus disinformation. What I used to say to people is that a lot of people say misinformation is sort of information that is spread sort of by accident, almost like, oops, I misinformed you, rather than disinformation being I'm actively, say, propagandizing you, trying to sway your viewpoint. Um, but I don't even think that's necessarily the case because the reality is that people use misinformation to describe a lot of different things. When I was putting together the talk, I was actually wondering if I should just throw out the term misinformation entirely and just say something like democratically harmful information, because the sort of theme of how I sewed things together was that was information that's bad for democracy or information that's good for democracy. Um, but I chose to stick with misinformation because it is a word that we hear a lot, and I think it doesn't have a sharp definition. So,
Good.
academic answer.
Okay, there we go. Academic, linguistic. Um, so here's a not so much a question as a kind of a comment that maybe you could respond to
Sure.
from Belinda Joyner. I used to watch the news a lot, but I had to stop and try to research things for myself. And maybe the related to that is, yeah, how high should our expectations be of our neighbors and people in our communities in terms of digging for for beyond what comes easily?
Right. I think yeah, that's a very good question because this is sort of why in the beginning I was, contrasting, Lippmann's view of the expert-driven top-down information world and Dewey's of the bottom-up, and saying that I think we actually need both. I don't think it's necessarily possible without systematic research to arrive at some truths about the world that we need to arrive at. And in that sense, I think journalism and news and scientific publication has a very important role to play there. The trick there is trying to, sort out bad journalism from good journalism, of course. So that's why you need that critical mindset, the sort of reflective way of consuming information. But then I do think at the same time, sometimes we live too much in the sort of top-down world, and we're not attuned to the realities of the people around us that they're experiencing, even if we think the realities are illegitimate. So I'll give a small example for this. Um, it's sort of a reality. When I was doing a lot of work with the groups at Tufts around the pro-Palestine student movements last year, um, it's very easy to sort of be like, I am more informed and I know what's going on in Palestine. I'm anti-Zionist. These are my beliefs. I think they're more just. But the reality is that a lot of students don't hold that view. And if you ignore that reality, and if you ignore that for the other students who might be Zionist leaning or don't know anything about Palestine, um, if you ignore that, you're sort of pushing away a whole type of information that's very important for making change because you need to bring those people in, or else your movement won't be big enough to actually succeed. And so when we see the splintering, we see our movements fail. So that's just to say that the things that I think we can trust our neighbors and community members for the most is their real felt experience, which is valuable information that we need to take political action.
So a couple of responses to that. What you just said reminded me from ancient history during the original Poor People's Campaign, when Jim Bevel, who was one of the leaders of the with Southern Christian Leadership Conference, came up to Washington, and he began his speech by saying, "News is what your friends tell you."
Hmm.
And I remember that now all these years. And listening to you, I'm also reminded, that there are many ways to come at change or truth. And I'm thinking that what you're saying here also underlines the importance of, as you say, critical thinking. So where do people learn critical thinking? In good schools and from family members who encourage it. which in turn means that part of what we're doing here means supporting good teachers, making sure schools have got the funds they need, and encouraging critical thinking there. So just to think in terms of different dimensions. There was a comment here from Dan Sean, which he then said you answered, which had
Okay.
to do with the importance of clubs or groups. When you were talking earlier, I was thinking about the book groups that a number of my friends are in. But maybe you could say a little bit more. Uh, we're in a situation. Just again, having watched over years, we came to, bowling alone was now some years ago, and it
Yeah.
was pointing to the increased atomization of our society. Hannah Arendt, in her book on the origins of totalitarianism, talks about the atomization of society, making it possible for totalitarian rule. And now we're what, 20 or 30 years past bowling alone, and we have technology like the technology we're using here, which allows for further segmentation and isolation. So maybe you could say just a little bit more about um, uh, possibilities, values of overcoming something we have by building groups.
Right. Yeah, it's true. I mean, yeah, I cited Bowling Alone several times, but it came out in the year 2000, which is now quite a long time ago. So, he was talking about television and emerging internet as the sort of dominant technological change, and we've seen a lot of change since then. Um, yeah, I think it's a bit tricky. So like I'm familiar with in the field of political science, bowling alone has actually had a sort of critical reception these days. And a lot of scholars say while Putnam was identifying, yes, true trends of sort of individualizing forces, community structures still do exist in society. And that's sort of what I was trying to get at with this idea that, if we view society as an ecosystem, we live in sub-ecosystems, right? Like we have community structures, but they do tend to be a bit homogenous, right? There are legitimate psychological forces that contribute to us having a hard time grouping up with people who are not like us and pushing us to group up with people who are more like us. But we know that there's a virtue and a real material value to diversity and having diverse groups and learning from other people, exposing yourself to new things. So it's interesting that I think we're simultaneously isolated and not isolated. We're not isolated because you can legitimately go on the internet and find a lot of people who think the way you do, and you can build community that way. But we are isolated in the fact that we don't often have these diverse groups of association, which do tend to be, I think, if you form groups in how I'd say real life, in your workplace, in your neighborhood, they do tend to be a bit more diverse because you're not self-selecting as much for people who share interests with you. Um, so I think it's not as stark as total atomization. And I think the community that we do have serves an incredible purpose to push back against the encroaching authoritarian regime. How we see like groups like this and other groups from the left do exist and push back and have a rich sort of community life. But the community life that we're missing is bridging over to the other communities, basically.
So the next comment follows just on what you said here, and may just take it a little bit further. Is one fundamental, this is from Luke Anavi, is one fundamental problem just that it's easier and more pleasant to listen to and dialogue with someone we already agree with than to actively seek out and to engage those with whom we do not agree? I mean, the problem of getting out of your comfort zone.
Yep, I would say emphatically yes. There is
Mhm.
like a lot of psychological research that just concludes that our nervous systems, our brains just have a much easier time getting along with people who we already get along with.
Mhm.
Um, but it's interesting because then when you think to times in your life where you maybe have experienced the most growth, uh, I tend to think of childhood, being a young person. I think it's a time of tremendous growth. We're all growing a lot. And I think if we remember back, we remember that that growth was not very easy, right? We're
Mm.
presented with a lot of information that makes us upset. We have to learn to get along with people who we don't get along with. And it's difficult, but we're growing tremendously as a result. Or think of learning a new skill. You really stink at it at first, and it's very frustrating. But if you stick with it, you eventually look back and you're like, I'm so glad I stuck with this because even though it was difficult, I'm so much more of a rich person now because I can do this. The same goes for overcoming that sort of difficulty in talking with people who disagree. And I'll say that I don't want to put it all on us to be, very tough and like, oh, we have to be incredible dialogue participants. I will put a ton of the blame on the media that we are subject to and the technology that we interact with each other through. It makes it incredibly difficult. So it's almost that we have to do even more work because the structures that exist in society are so bad for embracing diverse viewpoints and learning and growing in that way. But I think it really is worth it. And it could be that if we get more practiced at it, we can be a little better at this type of dialogue.
So I'll just say, as you're talking, I'm just remembering the fundamental transformation in my life when I went south in 1966 and worked in a community with basically black miners out of the mines and their families, and not a single man there had 10 fingers on his hands. And you learn a whole lot about the world you live in, being with people who are different than a Northeast liberal kid. John Ruhr, his name's Dr. John Ruhr, says, as AI generates better and ubiquitous deep fakes, is it possible that people will come to realize that no digital media can be trusted and turn back to the small in-person communities to discuss important issues? Good question.
Very insightful question. It's not where I thought the question was going to go, so I'm pleasantly surprised. Um, will people react to it and sort of reject that type of technology? Maybe. Um, it makes me think of, um, again, this is not something I have any expertise in, but it's just sort of anecdotal knowledge from stuff I read. Um, I have read things that younger people um, are very aware of the sort of over technologized, I suppose, life that that I would say like the micro generation above sort of grew up with. There's a term that some like people are saying it's like Gen Z is sort of like iPad. They were iPad babies. They were raised on iPads and now their brains are all messed up. So the generation below them, Gen Alpha, who are now becoming, I think like young teenagers or preteens, I'm not entirely sure, are actually rejecting that type of technology and saying this was actually bad for them. We don't want to engage with this. We want more in-person, real life stuff. So it may be absolutely that there's a widespread rejection of this kind of technology that's too dangerous, too manipulative. We actually want rich forms of interaction. And I would hope that that could become some sort of movement, right? That if enough people would do that, that would solve the problem that a lot of people in the sort of research community thinking about AI deepfakes and stuff have been trying to imagine regulation or something. If it started from people's own displeasure, that would be quite amazing. So try to spread that to other people. I feel empowered by your question. So
I'm gonna hope for that for my grandkids. So one an encouragement here from Belinda to just stand up for what we believe, and I hope people will be doing that this Saturday across the country. Then Luke and Anavi again. Would you define disinformation as misinformation intentionally distributed out of manipulative intent?
that is a definition that a lot of people use. Yes. Um, a fun fact for you, or maybe fun anecdote. Um, when you start to apply the disinformation framework of intentional manipulation to, say, a research project, say, for example, you're some random grad student who's not me, a few years ago trying to do a research project on disinformation and proving that media institutions were knowingly manipulating people, it turns out to be quite difficult to prove intentional manipulation. It's almost more of a legal thing of murder versus manslaughter, if you will. So it's useful because I think we do know that certain institutions and bodies have very vested interests in intentionally manipulating people. And I think they are doing that, but it's very hard to prove. But I think that's a good distinction between disinformation and misinformation. Yes.
Great, thank you. We have one last question here from Roger Smith. What about the relationship between propaganda and violence in this context, as theorized and practiced by Hitler, Goebbels, maybe Fox News? There is synergistic belief formation setting the stage for Holocaust activity and complicity. So, relationship between propaganda and violence in the context of misinformation and pursuit of truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely spot on. As you sort of mentioned it at the top of the talk, like misinformation studies, whatever word you want to call it, the studies that people are doing today have deep roots in the scholarship that people were doing during and after the world wars, where people were trying to figure out how did so many people go along with a genocide. And now I think you could argue that even though this country, the United States, is not directly perpetrating a genocide, it's the main sponsor of a genocide that is still actively unfolding. And the same exact narratives, same types of narratives that were used um, almost 100 years ago are being used today to justify the genocide in Palestine. I wrote a couple articles about this. If anyone is interested in Googling me and finding, I forget where I published them, maybe Common Dreams or something, um, tying back that history and showing some of the same types of um, sort of genocide justifying propaganda that is at play in US media. And I wrote them about a year ago. So that was when it was really sort of active and unfolding.
So I just say that, I mean, a number of comparisons are being made between Germany in the early 1930s and where we are now. And, I think we don't have to go as far as Palestine to be thinking about, are we becoming good Germans, as we think about the various responses to, the brutal kidnapping of people off our streets, and the deportations. And, the challenge, I think, among the challenges to us is how best we can respond to be preserving democracy here. I will say that I was very much encouraged by the demonstration the next day after Ms. Osterk was kidnapped off the streets of Somerville here in Massachusetts, a student at Tufts. People turned out, several thousand community leaders, and this is the kind of response we need to have happen. So as we close, Nick, I want to thank you, and I want to just say that given a lot of the conversations I've been in, a lot of the webinars I've been in of late, I found this really refreshing. An opportunity to kind of step back, be reflective, and the need to, if you will, be preserving our humanity as we go through this crisis. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank our listeners, to let people know that this session was recorded, and will be on our webpage, and we'll be able to share it more broadly. And just to thank you, wish you the best, and to wish everyone in this evening's webinar to be safe, and to hold on to your democratic commitments. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.